This is a walkthrough video of Under Layered Suspicion, a review of CRA audits of Muslim-led charities, specifically the case study on the Islamic Shi'a Assembly of Canada, or ISAC. Now, ISAC was an organization founded in 1993, made up of Shia Muslims here in the Greater Toronto area. It was designed to advance religion among the Shia and also advocate for the Shia and their interests, particularly in a context where, at least globally, we know that the Shia are a minority Muslim community within the larger sectarian context of Islam, with Sunnis in the majority and Shia in the minority. And oftentimes the Shia historically have been persecuted by the Sunnis. So what's interesting about the Islamic Shi'a Assembly of Canada is it presents the case of a minority within a minority here in Canada. On the one hand, it's a Muslim organization in Canada. So that's its one level of minority status. But within the world of Islamdom, or among Muslims, it's a minority there as well. So a minority within a minority. And so on the one hand, where it is cast as Muslim and therefore since at least certainly since 9/11, subject to the same kind of Islamophobic tendencies in society that we see across the board, it's also subject to a secondary level of sectarian rivalries. And so how it locates itself in the Canadian context certainly reflects that complex political dynamic. The organization was registered as a charity and organized to advance religion in 1994, originally under the name Ahl Bayt Assembly of North America. Now, it's important for us to take a moment and pause on this Arabic term Ahl Bayt, because it comes up both when the organization applied to Industry Canada for incorporation status, but also in the audit here that ultimately led to its deregistration. Ahl Bayt is an Arabic term which in English is translated as people of the house. But more specifically, within the Islamic context, it's a reference to people of the Prophet's house. In Shia Islam, theologically speaking, authority runs through the lineage of the Prophet, from him, his nephew Ali, and then so on and so forth to their children. Ali, who was married to Fatima, his daughter, and so on. So Ahlul Bayt is almost, in the world of Shia Islam, it's a generic term that signals the Shia Muslim community. And so on the one hand, it sounds perhaps to English ears or Anglo ears like a very specific term of art, which it is, but it's also very generic. And so on the one hand, when, for instance, Islamic Shia Assembly originally was applying for incorporation status, Industry Canada was concerned that, well, there's another Ahlul Bayt group in Montreal, the Ahlul Bayt group of Montreal, and it was worried about confusion between the organizations. So some explanation of what this term means and what it conveys, both in its generality, but also in its signifying effect, needed to be explained. We'll come back to this a little bit later in the report, in this particular video. So now what's important is that once the organization had originally applied for its registration with the CRA, it did go through some name changes. And it finally did change its name to the Islamic Shi'a Assembly of Canada. But in doing so, it issued a series of constitutional amendments to its original originating documents. And that became the vehicle by which the CRA began to then start thinking about its audit. It took issue with some of the constitutional changes, which were fair enough, some which could have been easily rectified through back and forth negotiations. But let's also keep in mind that this particular audit, these audits occurred in a political environment. And what's important in looking at this case study is that it's important to see the audit not only in accordance with the four corners of the page of each audit document, but rather in the larger context of global politics that were occurring in our world at that time. So in a sense, the ISAC case study takes three different timelines: the global politics that are occurring in the world, the domestic reception of those politics here in Canada, and then the third is the audit. Those are three different timelines that, in the case of ISAC, converge around within weeks of each other. Now, let's keep in mind that in 2011, Stephen Harper won a majority. His Conservatives won a majority in Parliament in the May 2011 elections. Contextually, this is important, given that the Harper government at the time of ISAC's audit at all times was rattling sabers at Iran during tense global discussions around nuclear non-proliferation and the protection of Israel from regional nuclear powers. From 2011 onward, ISAC was under audit for its activities between 2008 and 2010. But keep in mind that the audit of these previous 2 years was occurring while the government was going after Iran. Now, why is this important? Iran is home to some serious, most significant centers of Shia learning. In many ways, Iran is a home for Shia Islam, where the government itself is built upon this religious tradition. So whereas Saudi Arabia considers itself Sunni, whereas Morocco considers itself Sunni in its Islamic identity, Iran is the only country that adopts a majority Shia perspective. And so there was a conflation of Shia Islam with Iran that Iran purposely uses to bolster its own legitimacy and credibility. But that same conflation that Iran uses is now used by the Canadian government to paint Shia organizations like ISAC as suspect, as suspiciously connected to Iran, where any connection to Iran will be seen through this lens of anti-terrorism, which is what the Harper government was pushing on Iran for. So the audit itself occurring in this context is interesting. The first level of the audit argues that not all of ISAC's activities were designed to advance religion. Advancing religion was why it was organized. So then it argues, well, if not all your activities are designed to advance religion, what are they designed to? Well, they seem to serve a collateral political purpose, which is the language that they use. What's this collateral political purpose? Well, they find that a variety of activities that ISAC does seems connected to Iran. And third, they then show that through these collateral political purposes, they're connected to terrorist organizations like Hezbollah. So you can see the argument, not fully advancing religion, therefore doing something collateral and political. The collateral political purpose connects them to Iran, which is Harper's new bad guy in the world. And not only just that, but within that context, they're connected to a terrorist organization. So this brings in anti-terrorism financing. Let's show you how this worked. Now, how is it that there was a concern about whether or not ISAC advanced religion? Well, this is a bit of an interesting argument. Now, let's keep in mind what exactly this advancing religion idea means. The common law created this idea. It's there within the common law, but the common law defined the notion of religion very much in light of certain dominant Protestant ideals that existed in Britain at the time and have been passed on to us through this version of the common law. The problem is that does everything that Muslims do, or every religious tradition, do every religious tradition map or format neatly onto Protestant ideas of religion? Now, one of the things that we find is that ISAC's non-religious activity became a part of this analysis. Now, one of the key things that's very strange for us was that the Charities Director had said that ISAC's hosted a series of festivals at the end of Ramadan. Ramadan is the period when Muslims fast for 30 days, after which there is a celebration or an Eid. Now, what the Charities Director, it seems, considered strange was that for the years under audit, 2008 to 2010, these ISAC's Eid al-Fitr celebrations occurred on these dates, September 30th to October 1st, September 18th to the 20th, and September 9th to 10th. Sorry, Eid occurred on these dates, but ISAC hosted its events 2 weeks later on October 19th, October 4th, and September 19th, respectively. So effectively, there's about 10 days between when Eid occurred in the calendar and when ISAC hosted its religious event for Eid. And this seems suspicious to the charities director. Why? Well, the assumption is, wouldn't you have the festival celebration on the day of the festival itself? But why is that true? Why is that necessarily the case? If you're a religious tradition that's not Christian and your holidays are not statutorily protected like Christmas is, for instance, Christmas, the whole country shuts down. They're legislated into statute. Not every religion has the benefit of these statutorily protected religious holidays. And so if you don't have these statutory protected holidays in Canada, then you as a religious community, a minority religious community, have to negotiate with yourself, your community. How will you celebrate your religious holidays in light of school calendars, the start of school, exams for your students in your community, if you want to be inclusive? People's work schedules might not always allow them to celebrate it. Let's say if Eid settles on a work day, can you take the day off from work? Do you postpone it to the Saturday after? Maybe it's 2 Saturdays after because you want to rent a large facility. These are all logistics that minority religious communities that aren't protected by statutory recognition. These are the kinds of everyday negotiations that have to occur when you're trying to manage observation of religious beliefs and practices in a multicultural society in which you live as a minority. But nonetheless, the CRA said, these are the kinds of things that we're concerned about. We think this is not quite the religious activity we're interested in. So if you're not organized to advance religion, well, what are you organized to do? Well, there's these collateral political purposes, this connection to Iran. Now, keep in mind that when the Harper government came into power in 2006, the government joined the international community in imposing sanctions in response to Iran's nuclear program. By 2010, Canada created a sanctions regime under a Special Economic Measures Act, it's the Iran CEMA, based upon a finding by the Governing Council that Iran's failure to meet its international obligations amounted to a grave breach of international peace and security. Canada's antagonistic relationship to Iran grew as the Harper government gained a majority in 2011. The amendments to this Iran CEMA agreement occurred after the Harper government obtained a majority in Parliament. Likewise, ISAC's formal audit did not begin until 2011. In fact, the directorate's initial interview with ISAC members occurred in October 2011, 6 months after Harper's conservative government won a majority in Parliament, and only days after Harper declared Iran, quote, probably the most significant threat in the world to global peace and security. Now, of course, as we know, the Harper government's antagonism to Iran increased so much as to result in formal dissolution of diplomatic relations in September 2012. That antagonism was perhaps best expressed by then Foreign Minister John Baird in his October 1, 2012 address to the UN General Assembly, in which he stated, "Today, the most significant threat to global peace and security remains the regime in Iran. It refuses to comply with Security Council resolutions. It routinely threatens the very existence of the State of Israel. It provides aid, comfort, and support to terrorist groups. It is guilty of the wide and massive repression of the human rights of its own people, including gays, lesbians, and religious minorities. The government of Canada has not only formally listed the Iranian regime as a state sponsor of terrorism under Canadian law, but we have also suspended diplomatic relations. While Canada prizes engagement in open relations, there can be no open engagement with a regime that dishonors its word, repudiates its commitments, and threatens to perpetuate crimes against humanity." So here's the interesting rub. Iran becomes this specter, this pariah on the international stage. But ISAC as a Shia organization, can't help but recognize that if it's going to do work and advance its own religion, it has to remain connected to the seminaries that happen to be located in Iran. So how does it do that? Now, what's important is that in the course of the audit, we see that this chilly attitude towards Iran affected the very way the audit took shape. So, for instance, the audit in the audit of ISAC, there was a concern around its name again, that particularly the use of Ahlul Bayt. Why? Because in Iran, there's an organization called the Ahlul Bayt World Association, ABWA. So that means both ISAC in Canada and ABWA in Iran share this linkage through this generic name. And so suddenly now, the Charities Directorate, in the guise of its anti-terrorism concerns, has the same confusion as Industry Canada did years earlier around what does Ahlul Bayt mean? Though the problem here is that suddenly Ahlul Bayt links ISAC to Iran at a time when Iran is now listed as a state supporter of terrorism. So, unaware of how generic this term is, nonetheless, the auditors seem to think that ISAC, its political purposes, is to be a Canadian window, a Canadian office for ABWA, this Iranian organization. And so what's important is that as there's back and forth between ISAC officers and the CRA, there's some religious literacy that has to go on. But nonetheless, it seems that the auditors were convinced that ISAC is an ABWA representative. And so you can see from the questions that they directed, does a representative of ISAC, the assembly, participate in any conferences? Do you travel internationally? And then, of course, there's a focus on the categorical denial that ISAC is a branch of the Ahlul Bayt World Assembly. And so suddenly now there's all this focus on the Ahlul Bayt World Assembly in Iran. Are the Assembly's directors associated with the Ahlul Bayt Assembly in Iran? Does he, and so on and so forth. Suddenly, this connection to ABWA becomes central. Now, why the connection to ABWA? Well, the connection to ABWA is simply because in CRA's letter of July 21, 2008, the CRA noted that the Ahlul Bayt World Assembly's website contained a report written by ISAC. That's it. There is a report, there's a link on a website. Now, the fact is that no one from ISAC submitted the report according to its directors. Perhaps ABWA just picked it up, but that didn't seem to convince the auditors. The fact is that ABWA seemed to be this specter that haunted ISAC throughout. Now, what's also important in the ABWA connection is, well, who else is a member of ABWA? As it turns out, ABWA's membership includes people linked to the Lebanese group Hezbollah. Now, here's where ISAC gets doubly in trouble with the anti-terrorism financing regime. Hezbollah is on the list of terrorist entities here in Canada, which means that ISAC, because of its alleged connection to ABWA, was therefore allegedly connected to Hezbollah. That's it. Is there any indication or evidence that links them directly? No. What's the entire link is based on this one website by ABWA, a government of Iran or sponsored organization, a government which the Harper government said is not to be trusted. Yet the CRA trusts Iran's ABWA's website enough to suggest that ABWA must therefore be somehow related to ISAC. And so that's really the story. That's it. The evidence is limited. The evidence doesn't support necessarily a finding. It's circumstantial at best, but fairly flimsy. And the concern then is with the case of ISAC, you have this anti-terrorism policy lingering in the background. You have this saber rattling on Iran. You have this conflation by the Canadian government of Shiism and Iran that seems to take shape in very curious ways, and reliance on government of Iran websites at the same time that the Canadian government says the government of Iran is not to be trusted. There's a lot of curiosities in this case that raise questions about the integrity of the audit, the selection of evidence, and these are just some of the indications of what we found.